Before you start this episode, this is just a reminder that History Hack does have a Patreon account and a Ko-fi account as well. You can either register to subscribe and throw us a few quid every month, or simply buy us enough caffeine to continue through to the next episode, because frankly, we run on fumes most of the time.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. I am really pleased to be speaking to historian and journalist David Crossland, who's come to talk to us about his new book, Whispering Walls, First World War Graffiti. So, David, welcome to History Hack. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. Yes, glad to be here.
I was saying to you in the preamble, I really enjoyed reading. In a way, when we think of graffiti, you think of things that kids write on the bus stop and all the rude stuff I find in my son's playground. But this had a lot more depth to it.
Yes, it's a whole range. It's not just graffiti. It's also intricate carvings of regimental insignia, of beautiful women, especially in the case of French soldiers, but also just scribbled names, scribbled with pencil, and service numbers. There's a full range of graffiti reflecting all the different nationalities that converged on the Western Front.
Whereabouts can these carvings and graffiti be found?
Pretty much anywhere that men had the time and opportunity to leave these traces. There are especially many in the underground limestone quarries across Picardy and the Pas-de-Calais regions between the north of Paris and the English Channel. And Picardy in particular is famous for its limestone, and it's crisscrossed by labyrinthine quarries, and some of them are vast, and they're dug under the fields. And over the centuries, they were used as refuges in times of war. And so the armies of both sides discovered these quarries and used them as unit headquarters, field, first aid posts, storage sites. So the French, the Germans, the Brits, Australians, Canadians, they all used these sites. And because the men had the opportunity and time, they chose to immortalize themselves on the walls in all kinds of ways.
There's something similar in the tunnels on the Dover Castle as well. And I've been told down at Chatham Dockyards there's a wall where sailors would wait before being put on ship, and that they've all carved their names into the wall there as well.
Yes, of course, limestone being soft, it's very easy to sculpt. So they could use their knives, their bayonets, just to carve into it. And some of them had hours, because they were waiting to go into battle or because they were on rest and recuperation. So they got quite elaborate, and they would copy all kinds of motives that were around, all kinds of subjects around them, like coins or banknotes. There's a famous sculpture, a French sculpture, which copied Marianne, the bust of Marianne, the French national symbol, which was on a French coin. And the Germans, they were very keen on patriotic slogans like Gott mit uns, which was inscribed on their belt buckle, and Gott strafe England, God punish England. That was also a an anti-British war slogan. You can find that on the walls as well.
But like you said, there's also a lot of names sort of left behind. So I thought we could talk about a couple of them. You go in depth for a few of them. One of them was Corporal Adrian Edmonds.
That's right. He wrote his name in a tunnel under the village of Naur, which was north of Amiens. And Naur, I'll just briefly talk about Naur because it's a unique place, because its caves weren't used as a shelter. They were a tourist attraction, even during the war. And the Australians, in particular, ran guided tours of it. And it's still a tourist attraction. You can visit it. It's a museum, and over 3,000 inscriptions, mostly names, ranks, service numbers, have been found on these walls. And one of them was Lance Corporal Adrian Henry Edmonds of the 3rd Australian Division Signals Company. And he wrote his name on the wall on the 23rd of May, 1917. He even wrote about that visit in his diary. And his job was to lay telephone lines across battlefields. But like many Australians and Canadians, they'd come from thousands of miles away, so they were also very keen sightseers. So when you read his diary, he conveys the horror of the fighting alongside the beauty of the landscapes he traveled through. In his diary, he says in July 1916, he was on a troop train taking his unit to the Somme, and he wrote of, quote, hills covered with wheat interspersed with red poppies and cornflowers. A few weeks later, he goes on about very heavy shelling all day, many casualties, awful sights, half bodies, legs, arms lying about unburied. So it's a strange juxtaposition of describing the beauties around him and the horror. You know.
I suppose when there's that thing of, will I ever get back to see Europe again? So let's write down what I'm remembering. But then also, like you said, you've got the juxtaposition of the war, and so it's difficult to make interesting reading.
Yes, I mean he writes drinking water out of shell holes that has the flavour of dead bodies. And then he describes very dramatically a visit he took to Delville Wood, which was one of the bloodiest battlegrounds of the Somme, on Boxing Day, and describing shattered trees, trenches, shell holes, military gear, and corpses scattered everywhere still. And then he writes, if only those who are responsible for this terrible war could see these silent forms. And then he takes part in the Third Battle of Ypres. He's almost burned alive when a shell lands on flares near the door to his bunker. But a few weeks later, he's on leave in Paris, and he ticks off the sites in his diary: Place de Vendôme, Invalides, Napoleon's tomb, Eiffel Tower, even took in Versailles. I'm glad to say he survived the war, returned home in 1919, lived until 1968.
Wow. But someone who wasn't quite as lucky was Lieutenant L.R. Blake.
Yes, he was a geologist and a surveyor and an Antarctic explorer. He was a peer of Scott and Shackleton, and he went just before the war. He went on an expedition with the Australian explorer Douglas Mawson as a geologist and surveyor. He also wrote his name in Naur. And he was a lieutenant in the Australian Field Artillery. And he visited Naur in January 1917. He was in charge of a howitzer, but because he was a surveyor, that's what was his speciality. And during the Battle of the Somme, he was sent into no man's land in front of Pozières. His job was to survey the exact location of Allied lines, to prepare the artillery for the creeping barrage. He was wounded by a bullet to the buttocks, which drew taunts from his mates, but he won the Military Cross. And later, in 1917, he was presented with another award by King George V, and he spotted the white ribbon of the Polar Medal on Blake's tunic, and he asked him about it, and they spoke for 20 minutes. About Antarctica, and it went on so long that Blake had to break off the conversation. It said, "Excuse me, Your Majesty, I have an urgent dental appointment." Now, he had the option to join the staff and to get out of the fighting, but he didn't want to. He wanted to be with his mates. So during the Third Battle of Ypres, he was seriously wounded by a shell fragment to his forearm. Then in September 1918, it's just an illustration of this bizarre parallel world that these soldiers lived in. He wrote to his brother that he had just visited Nice, the south of France, Nice, Menton, Monte Carlo, Cannes, and he was talking about the beautiful vegetation there. And then 2nd of October, just weeks before the end of the war, he was on horseback supervising the unloading of ammunition, and a stray artillery shell exploded under his horse, badly injuring him, blowing off part of his left leg, fracturing his skull. He was operated on, but he died the next day.
Yeah.
But with, Blake to me represents what was lost, because when you research him, and the Herbert Dartnell wrote an excellent biography of him, you get a real sense that this guy he was only in his 20s. He would have resumed his research. He would have resumed exploration and surveying, geology. you get a sense not just of the tragedy of the loss of his life, but the loss of the potential in that generation. And
Yeah,
it's striking with these names, especially with Australian names and Canadian names. It's very easy to find out what happened to them, and it's when you stand there where they stood, with the chalk dust in the torchlight, and just stand where they wrote their names. It's quite a moving experience, because you can find out what happened to them quite easily by looking it up on the Canadian and Australian military archives, because they left so much information. In many cases, they left not just their name, their rank, they left their serial number, which makes it just immediate. You just find out immediately, what happened, They didn't know what was going to happen to them, and when they're writing, it sort of rings with the question, will I make it through this? When you stand there, you have the answer, and it's poignant.
I found that particular chapter really moving, especially in the case of Blake, because you have, like you said, the graffiti is kind of like a moment in time that's been captured.
Exactly.
Of I'm here now.
And there's all kinds of things. I mean, there's all kinds of. They scribbled their name, their rank, their service number, the name of a mate who had fallen, or they created portraits of their wives or girlfriend, or the pretty mademoiselle they saw in a cafe last month, or their farm animals back home, a favorite horse or dog, poem, sarcastic remark, patriotic slogan, Christian cross, regimental insignia, all kinds of things. But there's a huge variety of this graffiti. But they had one thing in common. Am I going to survive? Am I going to return to my loved ones? They want to be remembered, to prove their worth. That also comes through in this graffiti, what they had in common.
Because you've taken lots of wonderful photographs as well, and we'll come to them a bit later, but two of them caught my eye especially. One of them is, because I'm based in Kent, and my grandfather was in the East Kent, but I keep an eye on the West Kents as well, and there was a beautiful photograph of the West Kent regimental insignia on one of the walls, which kind of helps bring it home. And the other one was a very crude drawing of a man's genitalia, and I thought, you know what, men don't change.
No. I mean, these were young guys, teens and 20s. In fact, I'm surprised I didn't see more of that. But but the French in particular are very keen on big-breasted women. Often with holes drilled in the relevant places, and one hopes these holes were for candles.
Oh God, I hope so. Yeah, it did make me chuckle. I just saw that, and I just flashed back to when I was at school and seeing the graffiti that people would draw on the walls of the classroom when they were bored.
Unsigned, unfortunately, so it's remained anonymous. But
moving on to someone slightly more serious. Who was the modest VC?
That was another soldier who left his name in Naua while visiting it as a tourist. His name was Sergeant Samuel Mikosha of the West Yorkshire Regiment, and he won the Victoria Cross for an action in November 1915 near Ypres. His platoon was decimated by shell fire, which killed 6, wounded 7, buried most of the rest. But Mikosha, who was then a corporal, he took command, dug out the men in full view of the enemy with shell fire going on. Wow. He was awarded the Victoria Cross by King George in Buckingham Palace. He became a celebrity. He featured on the front page of the Daily Mirror. He was on the front page of his local newspaper, Bradford Weekly Telegraph, as the Bradford Man of the Week. There were photos of him at home and with his family, and he was invited to lunch with the Lord Mayor of Bradford. The Times wrote an article about it, and quote, he told the mayor, quote, he had only done what had been done by many others and what many others would do. He also featured on a Gallagher cigarette card collection of Victoria Cross heroes, but there are stories that he was uncomfortable with this fame, and there are stories also that he changed his name to Ingham, his mother's maiden name, because he was sick of all the attention. I couldn't get that confirmed by the family, however. He changed his name, but the reason for it, I'm not clear about. But he died in 1950, age 57, but his name made headlines again in 2001 when his Victoria Cross was sold at Sotheby's by his granddaughter to an anonymous private collector for over £100,000.
Wow. There were quite a few Victoria Cross holders who sometimes didn't. There were some that really revelled in the fame, and then others who did just sort of, I was just doing what I was supposed to do.
Yeah.
I could imagine the amount of fame that you would probably get quite annoyed with people banging on your door and taking photos of you and making a big special deal out of it.
Especially he had a Polish father, so his second name, Mikosza, was so memorable. That was another factor. He joined the army in the Second World War as well. I think he was a captain, but people kept saying, "Aren't you the Mikosza who won the VC?" And there are reports he got fed up with that, but as I said, I couldn't get that confirmed. I tried to ask the family about it, but I didn't get any answers on that.
My French pronunciation is really dicey, but tell us about the Banksy of Bouzincourt.
That's it. Yeah, they're mainly British and Canadian soldiers, and they made over 1,000 inscriptions in total in tunnels under the village of Bouzincourt on the Somme, just a few kilometers down the road from Albert. And in the build-up to the Battle of the Somme, and during it and just after it, most of these inscriptions were made then. And you can see that some were written on the same day by members of the same battalion. And here too, I mean, some of the authors are known to have been killed within days of making those inscriptions. And the French archaeologist Vincent Fèvre, he conducted an exhaustive study of the inscriptions, and he discovered a correlation between the number of inscriptions made per day and the ebb and flow of the battle. The volume of graffiti, he found that the volume of graffiti increased as British soldiers of the 32nd Division piled into Bouzincourt, as it was being turned into a military camp in preparation for the big push on the 1st of July. And you really get a sense of the PALS system in Bouzincourt, because many inscriptions reflect the pride and confidence of the new army. The guys who had flocked to recruitment centers. For example, there's a beautiful inscription, a cap badge drawn of the diehards, the 17th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment. That battalion was the Footballers Battalion, which contained professional players and referees, officials and fans from football clubs across Britain. And the battalion was a very important sense of identification for many soldiers because of the way that the British Army did its recruiting at the start of the First World War, because there were local recruitment drives among men of the same city of occupation. Friends, neighbours, colleagues joined so-called city battalions, or known as PALS battalions in the north. They were attracted by the promise that they would be able to stay together with their mates, but of course, given the scale of the casualties in the Battle of the Somme, the PALS system had disastrous consequences for the communities back home. Because of course, the British Army suffered over 57,000 casualties on the 1st of July alone. Worst ever told one day. 19,240 were killed.
Yeah.
More than 5,000 casualties came from London, 5,500 from Manchester, over 1,000 from Edinburgh, Leeds, Bradford, Birmingham. It was even worse for smaller communities like the Accrington Pals and the Grimsby Chums. So you get a sense of these Pals battalions at Bouzincourt because it's very closely linked to the Battle of the Somme.
Just out of curiosity, do they have a list of all the names that have been written in there?
Yes, they've catalogued them all. You can, Vincent Fèvre, he did a fantastic job. He did a master's degree on Bouzincourt, and also Bouzincourt's been 3D. It's been photographed in 3D, so they've measured it out and done a 3D version of it, because sadly, it's the inscriptions there are at risk from dampness, and especially when the soldiers used lead pencils. That's more enduring, but a lot of them use their trench pencils, ink pencils, and that's a problem because the ink soaks into the wall, and moisture can make the ink run. And Bouzincourt's got a problem with dampness. There's a risk of collapse. It's been completely shut for the last 3 years, I think. I went in there in 2019, was lucky to get in. Bouzincourt's at risk. There's one inscription I found particularly poignant. It was written by Private Daniel McAlpine of the 2nd Highland Light Infantry, and the inscription says "wounded 3 times," and that reference, that sort of rings with pride, but also hope that he had his share of bad luck and that he might survive. But sadly, he was killed 5 months later.
Yeah, I was just wondering because my grandmother's uncle was killed at the Somme in October, but he was there for the first day, and part of me wondered if he sort of left anything behind.
Yes. I mean, it's possible. I mean, one way is to try and find out if his unit was anywhere near Bouzincourt. That might be a start. But the problem with Bouzincourt is that it's not mentioned in any official military records, that, and at least the ones that I couldn't find any, neither could Fèvre, and it seems to have been just used quite haphazardly. The guys, the village itself came under shell fire, and the guys just piled into this set of tunnels, which was another one of these refuges dug under the French village, and they didn't spend very long in it, so the graffiti has quite a haphazard feel to it. But it was very relaxed down there. It was mainly, there's no evidence. And in fact, a lot of this graffiti was done by ordinary soldiers. You don't see many officers leaving graffiti. So they were just basically chilling.
Waiting out the barrel.
Not chilling's the wrong word, but they were just either waiting to go into action or recovering from it and, trying to while away the time,
Yeah.
Bouzincourt is where the big penis is as well.
Yeah, and the West Kents thing as well.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I wrote it in brackets next to my questions so that I could bring it up, but it felt natural to bring it up earlier. Before we get distracted by Willies again, let's move on to the 46th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force.
Yeah, they had the unfortunate nickname of being the Suicide Battalion because they were involved in every major battle the Canadians fought in between August 1916 and the armistice. And of the 5,374 officers and men who passed through that battalion, 4,917, which is 91%, were either killed or wounded.
Ouch.
Members of that battalion were in Bouzincourt and left their names there, and they include Private Roy Clinzing. He left his name in a list of 4 of his comrades, and with him too, he left his service number. You type in his service number, and the Canadian Canadian official records are so extensive. So you immediately found out where he was, what he did, what his medical records was. 5 feet 4 inches tall, fast runner, which was obviously perfect attributes for his job, which was to a runner, a key role in the war, where the telephone often broke down. He was a farmer from North Dakota, awarded the military medal for carrying on his duties during the assault on Vimy Ridge, while under rifle fire and machine gun fire, after being buried by a shell for a while. After having his arm dislocated, he showed, quote, cool indifference to danger.
Oh, God.
I survived the war despite being gassed, suffering from shell shock, and he lived to the age of 84, died in 1981.
Wow. Oh, God. That was some kind of machine.
Yeah.
I don't think
these every name has a story, obviously, behind it. Every name is worth researching. And with the Australians, as I say, with the Australians, the Canadians, it's relatively easy. With the Brits, it's difficult because so military records, so many military records were destroyed in the Blitz. I think 2/3 of the military records, of the army records, let me check that. I've got this here. Only 30% of service records from British Army soldiers survive, because the majority were destroyed by a fire at the Army Records Office in London in an air raid in 1940, and that makes it hard to find out about British soldiers. You know, they're in the hands of the National Archives. You can search and download service records, and they are digitized records, but you have to go through certain websites which you have to pay for. You know, it's quite an expensive affair, and there's a variety of websites. So yeah, it's not so easy unfortunately.
I volunteer at the Royal Engineers Museum, and the amount of requests we get saying, I'm trying to find my great grandfather in the First World War. He was a Royal Engineer. Okay. Do you have any more details? It's such an uphill struggle. But I was, before we started, I was saying my great grandfather somehow ended up in the Australian Army, and I just Googled it. I just went on the Australian War Memorial website and got an 18-page document of everything he was doing, a complete sick record. I look up my other grandfather. I'm lucky if I can find his service number.
Yeah, it's tragic. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah,
it's good that the Canadians and the Australian stuff is there. Give someone something.
Another guy who left his name at Bouzincourt was Alfred Cromwell Myers. He was a trainee school teacher, volunteered to join the Canadian Infantry, 1916, and he wrote his name in beautiful calligraphy. It would have impressed his pupils. A few months later, he took part in a daylight raid in preparation for the attack on Vimy Ridge. He was wounded after he entered a German trench, and according to a Canadian investigation, he sat down after he was wounded, told a comrade he would be all right in a few minutes and that he'd return to his own lines. And when the raid was ending, his comrades came back to see if he was still there, but he disappeared. And the German sources later said he'd been killed. He was filed as missing. His name was inscribed on a huge Canadian memorial on Vimy Ridge, but in 2015 he was found. And probably because researchers submitted a report to the Canadian War Graves Commission, concluding that his remains probably were lying in Cabaret Rouge cemetery in Souchez near Arras. So his last minutes might remain a mystery, but his probable final resting place is now known.
Oh, that's good. We've mentioned them briefly in passing. It's not just the Allies, but the Germans as well are leaving graffiti, aren't they?
That's right, but noticeably fewer. Which is surprising given that they held on to some of these quarries for years. One explanation could be that their commanders may have, which would have been typical, declared graffiti was verboten, and the Germans turned the tunnels into really well-equipped military bases, electric lighting, telephone cable. So did the Allies, but the Germans really made themselves comfortable, because I found a fascinating photo in the German Federal Archive of soldiers, got to be officers, in a garland festooned underground chamber with a piano, grandfather clock, cat, well-laid table, beer on either beer, I think it's wine on the table. You know they got it from villages around.
Yeah.
So a lot of the German writing on the wars tends to be very functional, like to the kitchen or to first platoon this way, because these were really well organized military bases. Often the Germans would even install their own walls just to shore up the entrances. very high quality war. I saw some examples of German some engineering near the Chemin des Dames ridge, in a quarry that they had held for years, between 1914 and 1917, and it looks like it was built yesterday. It's just absolutely beautiful brickwork. But there's also Gott mit uns, which the Germans had on their belt buckles. There's quite often you see Gott mit uns on the walls. There are some personal inscriptions, but with Germans, it's as difficult as it is with British, because a lot of German military records were destroyed in an RAF attack on Potsdam. And of course the German is very regionally fragmented, so you have to check the Württemberg records or the Bavarian records, and a lot of which aren't digitized. But luckily, some of the casualty lists have been digitized, so you can get a sense. You can get some information on some of the soldiers, but it's a hit and miss affair. There's one soldier, Lance Corporal Gefreiter Fritz Jenecke of the 20th Infantry Regiment. It says, in German, but let all the world speak ill of you. Just keep your conscience clean, then God will always be with you.
Yeah.
Actually, this is in memory of him. He must have fallen. His comrades wrote that in 1915. And then one interesting thing is, one inscription also left by soldiers of the 20th Infantry Regiment lists 3 soldiers underneath a little iron cross, which was also much in evidence, the iron cross, flanked with 2 flags of the Reich, in memory of the war years 1914, the stretcher bearers. And the writing is very, very neat. And there's an American author, Richard Rubin, who's been in this quarry, and he pointed out something that's very true. It really evokes the meticulous writing that might have been taught by a schoolmaster like Kantorek in Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, the teacher who put the whole class down to the recruiting office. These were young guys out of school, who'd just been to a good school, and they really wrote their names very, very neatly and quite youthful writing. They were schoolboys.
Hopefully not in the Gothic script, because that's always really difficult to read.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Germans were like everyone. Their mates and their military units were their surrogate families, bonded by shared experience, and that is reflected on the wars. Yeah. One quite illuminating bit of graffiti. One German soldier wrote in Latin, Ave Caesar morituri te salute, and Hail Caesar, we who are about to die salute you. And if you read that today, it sounds like bitter sarcasm, but the mindset of 1915, when morale was still strong, it reveals bravado, a soldier portraying himself as a heroic gladiator ready to lay down his life for his emperor, for his Kaiser.
No British phalluses drawn on the wall in German trenches.
No.
Too serious.
There's a lot of, they did, there's anti-British slogans, Gott strafe England, may God punish England. You see that quite a lot. And with the Germans and the French, you see how the soldiers were bombarded with patriotic emblems, propaganda on postcards and posters, on merchandise, bottles, cups, plates. In many cases, they just borrowed these images, and drew them on the walls. Sometimes there was real patriotism behind it, but sometimes they just was just whiling away the time. I'll do something. What shall I draw? I'll draw this. The
next one, we'll move away from the Germans to the French. They do some great carvings as well, like the again with my French pronunciation. Here we go. The altar of Confricourt.
Exactly. Yes. The French The French, they crafted real works of art, and they were less inhibited than the Anglo-Saxons when it came to depictions of the female form. They had a liking for big-breasted nudes with holes drilled in relevant places for candles, one hopes, and they carved, also French Catholic, they carved entire altars into the rock. And one of the most striking is in a quarry close to the ancient farm of Confricourt, which is 100 kilometers northeast of Paris. And next to the altar, they carved a flight of steps up to the trenches above the River Ain. And it was here in the first battle of the Aisne in September 1914 that the conflict turned into a war of trenches, as both sides dug in due to the incredible losses from artillery fire, machine guns. And the quarries were just a godsend for the men. The quarries were discovered as soon as the fighting started. Within a month, these quarries were put to use. The temperature was an unchanging 10 degrees all year round. And the troops quickly transformed them into subterranean barracks. One veteran likened it to Roman catacombs.
Yeah.
And here they made the engravings depicting loved ones, names of the fallen, but there were also elaborate regimental tableaux commissioned by commanders, like the 35th Regiment, Commander so-and-so, and then, Lieutenant so-and-so, and a beautiful framed tableau. And here also there's a really beautiful bas-relief of Marianne, the French national symbol, which was inspired by her profile on a French coin. The French, I interviewed the French historian Thierry Hardier, who's an authority on the graffiti, and he says by trying to create something of beauty, the soldiers were seeking to reintroduce the human into a war that was dehumanizing and had robbed them of their individual identity. But there were also carvings of everyday objects, such as bottles of pinard, which was a cheap red wine, treasured by the poilus, which is literally the nickname of the soldiers, the hairy ones.
I mean, the photographs of the altar is just absolutely amazing. It's stunning. The amount of time and effort that went into it must have been quite extensive.
Yes, it was commissioned by the chaplain of a French regiment who went on holding services there for years after the war ended. And 30 kilometers away, there's another quarry which was used by the French. More than 15 French regiments passed through the quarry of Montigny, including Zouaves, which was an elite light infantry formation, which originated in French North Africa. And the most prolific sculptor here was an opera singer, Marius Croppet. And he specialized in creating patriotic artworks like a sculpture featuring a French lion standing victorious on the back of a serpent-like monster with the face of the Kaiser wearing a little spiked helmet. And amazingly, this survived. The Germans moved in during the spring offensive. They were there for a few months in 1918, and it survived. They didn't. They walked past this every day, but they didn't destroy it.
Yeah, that's strange. I would have thought one Prussian officer might have taken exception to that.
Yeah. In fact, it's striking that the respect that the troops showed for each other's graffiti. Sometimes you see a French name next to a German name. As they took over these quarries from each other, there's very little evidence of them defacing each other's graffiti. They added to it. They wrote their names alongside it. They showed respect for each other, which I found very striking. And that is one famous one near Laon, where you see on the front of a quarry, the regimental insignia of a British regiment, a French regiment, and a German regiment in the sequence in which they occupied it, and
the sort of brothers in arms sort of ideal.
Well, it's an absence of hatred. It didn't just strike me. It's all the historians and the archaeologists who know much more about this, who've been going down these places for years. They told me this is what struck them as well: the respect the men showed for each other's work when they took over, and they knew they were all going through the same hell, because a lot of the time these were ordinary soldiers. As I say, they were not officers. They were in the same boat in a way. despite the national differences, they all shared the same motivation for leaving the traces.
Yeah.
That's what's it reminded me of. Did you see that Peter Jackson for the centenary? He made the film "They Shall Not Grow Old." A fantastic. He took hundreds of rows of footage of film from the First World War, and he colorized it. He slowed it down, and he brought these men to life. You know.
Yeah, it was creepy. It was kind of creepy's not the right word, but it was
a way, yes.
Very eerie to sort of look at the, especially when like there were units that would then go into battle, and you're like, wonder how many of these guys survived.
That's right.
And it was just, it's a bit again, unnerving feels like the wrong word, but it's how it struck me.
But he was asked afterwards. There was this panel discussion at the British Film Institute. He was asked, you went through all these hundreds of hours. What struck you most about what you saw? And I found it fascinating. He said what struck him most was the sight of British and German medics battling together to save the lives of soldiers regardless of their nationality. You know, the absence of hatred is what struck him most. It just chimes with these graffitis somehow. And also the German historian Thomas Weber, he's about to publish a book about Christmas truces. You know, there's this people think it only happened once in 1914. He says these truces were going on all the time. There were Easter truces, impromptu truces. This was a common trait of trench life, suppressed by the news of it did not reach home, and it seems to have been for the past century. People just don't realize to what extent these truces took place, and again, an absence of hatred.
Yeah, I remember reading an article, a book on the First World War years ago, and there was a British regiment received a message, came over from the German trenches. I think it was in an empty shell case or something, and it said, we're a Saxon regiment. You're Anglo-Saxons. You're the same as us. You don't shoot at us. We don't shoot at you. Then about a month later, another message came over and said, we're going back into reserve now. The Prussians are coming in. They're not like us. To fire at you.
That's right. Yes. The Prussians are very, very different race. Yes.
I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the Americans briefly. They left a few things around Fouademont.
Yes, I went into this fascinating quarry near the Chemin, actually meters away from the Chemin des Dames, which is this 25-kilometer ridge, which was the front line held by the Germans for most of the time. But one quarry was taken over by the Americans in early 1918. And in 6 weeks, the Americans left over 1,000 inscriptions. But by comparison, the Germans had been there for a number of years, almost 3 years. There was just a few dozen. Right, but the Americans came in, and you just get a sense of the exuberance of the troops, raring to get into the fight. They carved their names in big, bold letters, some of which resemble the fonts of advertising billboards. You know, that these carvings, they look so, even now, so fresh and pulsating. You get a sense of the power and the energy behind it, and it really seems to augur the outcome of the war, because with 2 million of these guys joining the fight, you just get a sense the Allies just weren't going to lose. And these men were from the US 26th Division, nicknamed the Yankee Division because they were made up of National Guard troops, mainly from the 6 New England states. Volunteers, many were relatively recent immigrants to the US from countries like Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Italy, Scotland. And Froidemont, which was another one of these quarries, was big enough to accommodate hundreds of men. You get carvings like Buffalo Bill, Native Americans with feather headdresses, and many carvings of the square and compasses that reflects how popular Freemasons were in America at the time. Britain too, I think. But I mean, you really see loads of Masonic symbols down there. And one Yankee who wrote his name in a quarry near there, which was also occupied by the Yankee division, the 103rd Regiment, was Ralph T. Mohn. He wrote a diary, and in the diary at first he sounds excited at the prospect of getting into the fight, and he sets about souvenir hunting, despite French warnings that things left lying around on the ground like helmets were often booby-trapped. But you get a sense when you read the diary, as soon as he got closer to the action in the weeks that followed in the spring of 1918, he started witnessing its horrors. He was sounding a lot less enthusiastic. He writes about coming under intense German bombardment with heavy shells, and says, quote, "Believe me, the man who said he was not scared is a liar." He reported seeing a man with his head blown off, and then he stopped his diary just a few days later, writing, quote, "From now on, all we see as hell is hell." So he just gave up writing about it.
It's the arc that so many young men of Britain and France and Germany in 1914, and now the Americans in 1917, is like, great, we're going to war. This is going to be a jolly adventure, and isn't this lovely? Oh my God, this is horrific.
Yeah, you really get a sense of this enthusiasm on the walls. But I thought Mohn's diary was very...
Like you said earlier, that with the dampness destroying some of the quarries, is there any move to try and preserve these at all?
Yes. In the last few years, sites like Bouzincourt especially, dampness is causing the inscriptions to dissolve. A quarter of the inscriptions at Bouzincourt are deemed to be in a poor or very poor state of conservation. And at Naur, the rub of a tourist's shoulder against the wall can wipe out 100-year-old story. So and the quarries are also vulnerable to looters looking for collectibles, because some of them are still filled with bully beef tins and discarded boots, barbed wire, shell casings, gas masks, stuff like that, still hanging around in these, lying around in these sites. Because, but anyway, in recent years, archaeologists have recognized the urgency of recording the sites and the graffiti, and there's a wave of fresh research underway. There's been a systematic cataloging of some sites, such as Naur, such as Bouzincourt, and there are projects underway to create 3D digital imagery of the caves, which may be the only way to keep this testimony alive for posterity.
Yeah,
and ensure broad access to it, because the sites a lot of them are just shut off. You can't get in them. It's dangerous to enter them. So, mass tourism is out of the question for a lot of them, although some can be visited, like Naur is definitely worth visiting. Montigny is worth visiting. I mentioned that earlier near the village of Machemont. Contrecourt, you can, if you're persuasive, get into some areas of it. And of course the Wellington tunnels near Arras, that's a major tourist site, and you can see some graffiti in that. Anyway, local heritage associations play a very important part in protecting the sites. And they have been alerting authorities for decades that funding is needed and that these places need to be protected. And they have had some success. About a dozen of them have been declared as historic monuments in the 1990s. But there is no sort of nationally funded or EU program to protect them as a whole. And I think there should be, because I think collectively they warrant becoming a UNESCO World Heritage Site, given that this is where a whole generation of men from all over the world converged for this disastrous conflict and immortalized themselves. I think it also clearly warrants more research, because there are an estimated 400 of these quarries in the Picardy and Nord-Pas-de-Calais regions alone, which was the site of the the Aisne, Oise, Somme, Arras battle sectors. 400 of these quarries known to contain significant amounts of graffiti. And you're not telling me that there aren't more underground. I mean, these places are everywhere. Every village had one of its own quarries. They used the quarries to extract stones to build the villages. So they go on for hundreds of meters. Some of them go on for kilometers. They're in the blackness. There must be inscriptions which have not been discovered or which have been forgotten, and which should be researched, I think.
Absolutely. I remember seeing quite a while ago. There was a program where they had unearthed an old Royal Engineer tunnelling sap, and they were going through, and there was just graffiti on the walls there of just tunnelling sappers who just sort of left their name and number.
Yes.
And it was like they'd being unearthed for the first time since 1918. So yeah, I believe you that there's probably miles and miles of this stuff just waiting to be discovered.
There's a British group called the Durand Group, which is made up of military experts, bomb disposal experts, and engineers, and they have been doing very intensive research of underground battle sites. They started out underneath Vimy Ridge, and they've also researched other areas, and they have found graffiti in tunnels dug for mines and for access to trenches, man-made tunnels. Yes, so there's a whole subterranean battlefield under the Western Front, which much of which has yet to be explored. Add one thing. There's this Fradmois quarry is absolutely stunning, and it's the guardian of this quarry is Gilles Chauvin. He's the president of the Chemin des Dames Association. He led me down it. You have to go down 2 5-meter ladders and uneven. And it's quite challenging carrying lights, photographic equipment, tripods down here. He gave me a good quote. He said, I asked him, why did they spend all this time doing this? And he said, they have to keep themselves occupied at night ahead of an attack or during bombardment. If you don't occupy your spirit, you go mad. It is a way of mentally escaping the horror. Also, they all shared the fear of death. They all wanted to show, I was here. I participated in something extraordinary. I did my job. No one wants to be forgotten. They were worried not just about dying, but about literally disappearing at any time, being obliterated by a shell so that there would be nothing left of them. These inscriptions are like bottles thrown into the sea. I think that quote sums up the graffiti.
Absolutely, yeah. I can't add anything to that. So, Dave, thank you very much for coming on and talking to us about your book. It's due out pretty soon, isn't it?
Yes, it's due out on May the 15th. It's called Whispering Walls, First World War Graffiti. It has it has over 140 photos in it of the most striking graffiti that I found. And it was absolutely fascinating to work on, and I hope to continue this research.
For what it's worth, I really enjoyed the book, so I'm recommending it to our listeners. When I sort of went into it, thinking, they're just names written on the wall, but the more you read it, as with the quote you ended with, it just becomes so much more poignant and so much. The names and deeds echoing through eternity, just scrawled on a wall.
That's right, and the last veterans died a decade ago, more than a decade ago, and it's like very direct testimony. It cuts through time. It's very immediate. It's not, this is what it was like. It's not soldiers remembering through decades. It is, this is what it is like. You see what they were feeling in the moment, what they were thinking, what they were going through in a way. It's immediate testimony, I find. And, just when you stand there, as I say, when you stand there where they stood and looking at what they did, it's humbling and it's poignant.
Yeah, absolutely.
And inspiring, because it shows how the spirit and morale can survive extreme conflict. You do not spend hours crafting the cap badge of your regiment if your morale is down. I mean, this is striking, it's a human reaction to extreme conflict. It also says something about that.
Absolutely, yeah. And the sort of mindset of the men involved. We're probably going to end up chatting for a bit after I hit stop record. This has been really fantastic, and as I said, I recommend it.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.